Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is 2:30, and although there's some confusion in the program versions about when this session is due to start, it's due to start right now. So we're going to begin, and I'm very happy to welcome you all back again. This session is titled A Nuanced History, a Challenging Present. And true to the topic itself, we're going to have a very complicated technological session moving between live presentations, Zoom presentations, online questions, and live questions with our remote presenters as well. So fasten your seatbelts, and hopefully this is all going to work out. We're going to be covering quite a wide chronological range. We're talking about historical keyboards and women in keyboard history. Our three papers today cover a whole range of topics, from the workshop of the distinguished female piano maker Nanette Streicher in early 19th century Vienna, through women organists in Buffalo, New York in the early 20th century, to the status of women as professional harpsichords in Europe and the US today. Our presenters are in Sweden, in Paris, in Montreal, and also will be right here. So without further ado, let us begin with our first presentation. We have a Zoom presentation by Tilman Skowroneck and Hester Jordan, and the title is A Woman in the Workshop, Conflicting Tales of Nanette Streicher. And I would invite you to look for the bios of our presenters in the program book. We won't take time reading them now, but please welcome Tilman and Hester.
Would you guys just like to wave hello before we start the video? Thank you. And we'll be back with you in a bit for questioning.
So, welcome to this presentation, A Woman in the Workshop and the Concert Hall, Conflicting Tales of Nanette Streicher, co-presented by Hester Jordan and Tilman Skowroneck. In the beginning, I wanted to thank the Diversity and Belonging Conference for making it possible to make this presentation as a pre-recorded presentation. And I'm going to launch right into it by sharing my screen. And also by starting the PowerPoint. And here we are. Nanette Streicher, born Stein, is today seen as one of the most influential Viennese piano builders around 1800. Especially since performers have rediscovered the historical piano for performing Beethoven's music, her instruments have risen to new fame, perhaps mainly because of the close connection between the Streicher firm and Beethoven, but also because of the obvious qualities of many of the surviving instruments. The overarching aim of this joint presentation is not to retell parts of Nanette Streicher's story in order to point out the excellence of her achievements or her special status as a woman entrepreneur in a largely male-dominated environment. What has interested us is to review and contextualize the way Streicher was talked about in her various roles. The first half of this talk, presented by Tilman, explores two key questions. How were descriptive language and recurring images used to shape her profile, her public profile, and that of her firm? How did, somewhat later, a tendency establish itself to describe the development of the Streicher pianos as the result of the efforts of her husband, Andreas Streicher? The second half, presented by Hester, contextualizes Nanette Streicher-Stein's work in relation to gender and class, considers how her own piano playing intersected with her work as a piano maker, and examines further ways in which Nanette and Andreas worked together as a married couple. Nanette was the daughter of the keyboard instrument builder Johann Andreas Stein of Augsburg, who was famous at his own time for his inventiveness and innovative spirit. Stein's influence lasted even as the piano grew in size and popularity, because he had developed the so-called German hammer action, which established the basic principle for the slightly later and more famous Viennese action. When Stein died in early 1792, less than 2 months after Mozart, Nanette, who had been trained in instrument building since childhood, took over the Augsburg workshop along with one of her younger brothers, Matthäus Andreas. On August 16, 1794, Nanette and Matthäus Andreas officially announced the establishment of their firm in Vienna. The move of the firm had taken place over the previous few weeks. You have to imagine a raft on the Danube River transporting timber, machinery, and tools, accompanied by Nanette, now married to the clavier player, teacher, and composer Andreas Streicher, her younger brothers Matthäus Andreas and Andreas Friedrich Stein, and at least one journeyman. So how does one go about establishing and running a piano building firm in a new and competitive environment? The sources about Geschwister Stein firm fall into few easily separable categories. First, some letters, by the Streichers themselves or addressed to them or about them. Second, contemporary writings about the firm, official announcements in newspapers. Third, a number of dictionary-like texts about the firm's activities from slightly later dates. And finally, 2 obituaries of Nanette and Andreas Streicher from 1833 and 1834. At the same time, the documentation is occasionally patchy, and it is not always easy to avoid filling in the gaps with one's own expectations. In a collection of letters from 1792 and 1793, written by Nanette Stein to her then future husband Andreas Streicher, Nanette discloses some details about her engagement in the firm just after the death of her father, Johann Andreas Stein, in 1792. Personal letters like these between people who trust each other and don't need to make things up are, of course, easiest to accept as vessels of truth. As mentioned earlier, while still in Augsburg, Nanette and her brother had taken over management of the firm and kept fulfilling orders. They were indeed working together, although Matthäus Andreas had just turned 16 at the time of his father's death. Nanette, however, writes in the first person. I received an order for a fortepiano, she writes. Or, I had to write a public statement to refute some rumors about the declining quality of the instruments. And, I am receiving many visitors and am overwhelmed with work. She was also socializing with friends, playing new music on the piano that Andreas Streicher had composed for her, and she was planning to travel to Munich to visit him. Interesting here is what is not mentioned in these letters. There is no information about what Matthäus Andreas was doing at the time. Was he perhaps the one who was more engaged in the workshop, whereas Nanette represented the firm outwardly? No, this cannot be true, because it was Nanette who was the famous piano builder. Or was she? It is good to remind ourselves that there is very little information about the actual distribution of tasks and the day-to-day doings of either of the Stein siblings up to 1802, when they went their separate ways, or regarding Nanette and Andreas Streicher after 1802, when Nanette established a piano building firm of her own. What we do have is information about how the firm wanted to be seen at various times, which brings us back to the question of how it became established and operational in this new environment in Vienna. The question of who did what the stuff we could imagine being taken up at Monday morning briefings or scheduled business lunches was definitely not what the Geschwister Stein wanted to advertise. Instead, the firm focused on familiarizing the public with their products in a different and specific way, which can be shown in a number of documents from the end of the century. The first of these is the much-quoted Jahrbuch der Tonkunst von Wien und Prag from 1796. The information for this book was collected in 1795 by its author and publisher Johann Ferdinand Ritter von Schönfeld. It should be said that the reviewer in the new and influential Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung was pointedly unflattering about the result, calling it, quote, a book printer's speculation compiled by an ignoramus, unquote, whose only serious objective was to say something nice about everyone. However, when it comes to his account of Nanette and Andreas Streicher, Schönfeld was likely aided by the fact that his own wife's piano teacher, Leopold Kotzeluch, was about to retire, and Andreas Streicher was his successor. Most of the information we find under his 3 entries about Nanette and Andreas and the piano building firm seems to have come from close to the source. Schönfeld depicts Nanette Streicher as a very capable fortepiano player who has such complete command over his instrument, this instrument, that it has to answer to the entire feeling of her heart. Under her fingers, he writes, the tones increase and melt away to any intended degree and might vanish, in a manner of speaking, all the way into the inaudible. Whoever wants to get to know all the properties of a good fortepiano will have to listen to her. The pianos made by Nanette match, in Schönfeld's description, her playing perfectly. Their tone is not incisive, but melting. They need to be played with a light hand, an elastic finger pressure, and a feeling heart. The same image of the sympathetic player's hands and the responsive character of the instruments made by these hands also appears in Andreas Streicher's own booklet from 1801 about playing, tuning, and maintaining the fortepianos by the Geschwister Stein. Streicher conceived his text as a combined performance guidebook, instruction manual, and a piano maker's mission statement. In a key passage, he states that the Stein instruments were manufactured, quote, specifically regarding their keyboard and tone by hands that themselves are to a high degree able to play the clavier and are only therefore able to prepare, that is, when making the pianos, whatever the musician needs for playing with the greatest ease, unquote. The piano builder's hands resurface a third time in a letter from December 26, 1800, written by one Karl Amenda, who was ordering 2 Stein pianos to be delivered to Latvia. The addressee is Andreas Streicher. One thing we do know about who did what is that Andreas had taken on the role as secretary of the Geschwister Stein firm in the late 1790s. In the course of outlining the specifics of his order, Amenda assures Andreas that he is aware of the high quality of the instruments. I am very familiar with the diligence of the dear master's hand, he writes. The seemingly gratuitous insertion of the adjective lieben, or dear, in a man-to-man conversation leaves little doubt that Amenda too is talking about Nanette's hands. The fact he does so in a letter written in a spirit of mutual understanding and directed to Streicher seems to indicate that this specific master's hand had become part of an established discourse. Returning to Schönfeld, then, one begins to suspect that the phrases he is using may have been spoon-fed to him by the Streichers too. The idea of a symbiosis between the builder and the player was part of the Stein family lore. Father Johann Andreas Stein had been hugely successful making pianos and other keyboard instruments with the specific aim of matching the 18th century aesthetic of light and shade in music, and he educated his daughter in the same spirit. Not only did Annette, beginning in her 10th year, learn to make action parts, install keyboards, tune and regulate the actions, as we can read in her obituary. As a player and guided by the most precise knowledge of the action, she was also taught to elicit the most beautiful tone from the instrument. As the story went, Stein did not allow a visitor to try out his fortepianos before the daughter had extracted everything from the instrument that he or she first had incorporated in it. Well, all these quotes come from her obituary. It seems that it was above all Andreas Streicher who realized that the image of sensitive instruments made by sensitive hands and, as Schoenfeld writes elsewhere, for sensitive players, was the perfect vehicle for advertising the Geschwisterstein pianos. For Vienna, with its abundance of capable piano makers, it was paramount to find a formula for distinguishing the Geschwisterstein from their competitors, and this was such a formula. Although we can be quite certain that it reflected Nanette Streicher's actual involvement in the firm rather faithfully, this is obviously not the issue here. We are talking about branding and visibility. We also notice that the person patently invisible in these descriptions remains the other Stein sibling. Matthäus Andreas Stein was, as his later career shows, an excellent piano maker in his own right, and in fact he became more influential within the Geschwisterstein firm over time. At least during the firm's final years, it appears that he had advanced to being the first face whom many people saw who visited the workshop. In a letter from 1801, for example, he is mentioned first of all. Quote, "I do not believe that any instrument maker makes use of more theory, talent, and practical and mechanical devices of the art for the manufacture of his instruments than the young Stein and his sister, who is married to Streicher," unquote. The passage goes. Viewed from Matthäus Andreas' side, it must have become increasingly frustrating to cater to the image of his older sister's excellence as presented by the writings of his brother-in-law. Tensions ensued, and in 1802 the firm broke apart. The underlying circumstances are not relevant here, but it is interesting to look at how the siblings now attempted to rebrand their respective productions. In advertisements in the Wiener Zeitung, Matthäus Andreas Stein announced to lovers of the Stein fortepianos his separation from his sister and his establishment of a firm under his own name, and that the firm of Geschwisterstein had closed. These are the tools he uses to make an impression. His use of the name Stein fortepianos. He reapplied to Stein's future production while addressing former and future customers under the umbrella term Liebhaber or lovers. Announcing his future autonomy, having begun his entirely own firm at his own address. Controlling the conversation by being the first one to announce the end of the Geschwisterstein firm. And finally, a quality statement by implication. In his final sentence, he promises to keep true to the reputation of his late father. On December 29, 1802, Andreas Streicher published a corresponding advertisement in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. Quote, "Advertisement concerning the Stein keyboard instruments. Undersigned herewith informs the public that his wife, born Nanette Stein, will in the future see to the manufacture of keyboard instruments under her own name. She believes she owes it to art and to her own honor to give her works a perfection that corresponds to the rigorous requirements of the connoisseurs." Unquote. Nanette Streicher's emerging professional profile rests, like her brothers, on the name Stein, but apart from that, she draws exclusively on her own reputation. The old firm Geschwisterstein is not even mentioned. The guarantee of quality is here made on the grounds of her own obligations to the art of music and her honor. The owner of the new firm was Nanette. A seemingly somewhat frenzied and protective Andreas Streicher worked in the background to reconfirm business ties and establish new ones. As late as in 1833, in Nanette Streicher's obituary, Andreas explains that it had been he who had insisted on making her the owner, not only because she had earned the right to it due to her devotion to her so very excellent father, but also because she was the one who had, quote, the most precise knowledge of the mechanism that gave the fortepiano its actual value, unquote. The builder's knowing and experienced hands are still an implicit part of the conversation, in other words. The new firm built on sympathies Nanette had gathered throughout the years, now adding an element of uncommon daringness to the enterprise, which might have been of special appeal to part of the public. The first decade of the Streicher firm saw a rather sudden departure from the 18th century fortepiano ideals of sensitivity and a move towards heavier, louder models with larger keyboards and a much higher string load to sustain. In this context, it does become more important to understand who did what in the firm, because at this juncture, Andreas Streicher changed career and became involved in the workshop as a piano builder. He also discussed the changes in the production in several letters to Gottfried Christoph Hertel of Leipzig, probably Streicher's most important business associate at the time, and it is striking that he always uses the first person in these letters. Now, some of the changes in Nanette Streicher's production are bold enough to have required solid knowledge of the craft. Of course, the piano teacher and composer Andreas Streicher did not one day simply waltz into the workshop to show a plan of his new piano model to an assembly of apprentices, journeymen, and the firm owner, his wife, who all nodded meekly and said, "Yes, this is how we will make our instruments from now on." Even if some of the ideas perhaps did come from him or from Hertel, he simply had to rely on the experience of Nanette or some of the better journeymen to create an actual instrument out of them. There can simply be no way around it. Nanette Streicher must have been intensely involved in these developments, and most importantly, if Andreas Streicher indeed eventually emerged as an actual piano builder, she must have been an excellent coach as well. Interestingly then, the public image of the firm changed nevertheless. Nanette remained the owner, a name on the instrument's nameplate, and a presence in Viennese music life. But the conversation about Streicher's pianos successively shifted towards talking about Andreas Streicher as being the one who was the actual piano builder. There are, for example, only 9 years between Amenda's reference to Nanette's dear master's hand and a description by Johann Friedrich Reichardt of the excellent instrument maker Streicher, who has the worthy daughter of the genius Stein from Augsburg as his wife, who also is a good piano player, as Reichardt writes. But this is a detour. Hester will later return to the Streicher reception history, with its tendency to name Andreas Streicher first and sometimes Nanette Streicher not at all. First, she will weave Nanette's dear hands into the context of Nanette's many roles as a 19th century woman.
Thank you, Tilman. So I will now share my screen. As well as identifying and valuing Nanette's labour in the workshop as a piano maker, I would now like to explore other forms of work she engaged in, because her labour as a pianist, a mistress of the house, and host all have direct bearing on her work as a piano maker. Nanette pulled a rather extreme version of the so-called double shift as both a working woman and a married one. The term Meisterin the feminine form of master used by Schoenfeld in his Jahrbuch, succinctly captures her overlapping positions and duties. She was both the master craftswoman and the mistress of, and the wife of the master of the house. She was the head of the workshop and the Hausmutter. This all meant that in addition to her roles on the workshop floor, she oversaw the daily running of her household and was responsible for the physical, emotional, and even spiritual needs of everyone under her care in partnership with and on behalf of her husband. So that included younger siblings, children, journeymen, apprentices, and servants. Situating Naneta in her historical context regarding gender, class, economic position, and married status give us a new perspective on her place in society and in her relationships. Feminist historians have furthermore repeatedly demonstrated that women like Naneta had much greater economic and social agency before the 20th century than linear stories of European gender progress tend to convey. So Naneta was a well-educated woman from a successful middling-class artisan family who had her own occupation and a business to go with it. She therefore had access to social status and a measure of economic independence. For example, she appears to have exerted considerable agency in forming and formalizing her relationship with Andreas. In letters to her then fiancé, she refers to the fact that she's conducting the relationship in secret and without the consent of her mother, not because her mother had a veto power over the choice of spouse, but out of a personal decision to keep familial peace. Naneta's economic self-sufficiency, her age, so at 25 she was of legal maturity, and the fact that her father had already passed away were significant factors in her ability to act independently regarding marriage. As Andreas came from a relatively poor background, he essentially married into her family business, much like a second husband marrying a widow of property. Marrying in required the socially and or economically dependent husband to either stay out of his wife's business or conform to the needs of that business and its existing structures in order for the union and the company to continue smoothly. During courtship and upon entering marriage, Naneta was therefore in a strong position as a woman with assets and the ability to support herself financially. Historian Heide Wunder has described marriage in early modern German areas as an inherently independent undertaking. So wives and husbands were not legally equal, nor were they socially equal based on gender. But the creation and continuation of the ideal household depended on their collaboration and placed them jointly at the top of the household hierarchy. It is clear from Naneta's courtship letters that affection and loyalty were also important to her relationship with Andreas, and suggests that their marriage was companionate in nature. Other sources that Tilman has introduced, such as articles and Naneta's obituary, furthermore attest to the fact that the success of the Streicherstein business was in part the result of successful collaboration between spouses. Like the ideal household then, the Streicherstein business required the labor and skills of both Naneta and Andreas to function effectively. Tilman has illustrated that piano making was closely tied to piano playing for Naneta from her earliest years. Her obituary tells us that she was a 3-time student of her father Stein, who also taught her to play piano and to sing, and that by age 8, she was helping to display his instruments through demonstrations. Her sympathetic hands were cultivated for the benefit of the family firm from the very beginning. Indeed, the act of playing a Stein piano was another form of advertisement for the instruments that Naneta practiced from childhood. And it continued to be the most visible form of work she engaged in for the company as a teenager and a young adult in Augsburg. And this remained important after she moved her business to Vienna in 1794. Contemporary accounts of Naneta's playing in correspondence and published writing show that, in addition to presenting instruments to visitors and potential customers, the attractiveness of her playing was a successful means of spreading news of Stein pianos by word of mouth. So artist Michael Denzel, in his 1789 painting Der Klavierbauer Andreas Stein im Kreise seiner Familie, provides visual evidence of the setting in which Naneta typically performed at this time. And I invite you to look at this painting now by clicking on the link in the description box below, which will take you to the website of the Deutsches Historisches Museum and a small reproduction of the painting. This painting shows Naneta playing in the Stein piano salon, surrounded by visitors, with her father leaning on the piano and other guests and family members scattered about the room, listening to her, talking to each other, and looking at paintings on the walls. The Denzel painting and correspondence, along with a Stammbuch, or autograph album, Naneta kept in the 1780s, attest to the significance of sociability in her work and the mingling of musical performance with business. Naneta not only played her instruments at such gatherings and in more informal contexts, she also acted as host and conversed with her guests. Piano playing and sociability, and indeed the sociability of piano playing, were of course strongly associated with women in early 19th century German lands. For example, the central role of keyboard-playing women like Sarah Levy née Itzhak and her great-niece, Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, in the sociable space of the musical salon has been increasingly well documented. Ruth Solé has also explored how middle-class women and girls were expected to undertake the emotional grunt work of their families by cultivating the moral and emotional health of their male relatives through activities like piano playing. Hosting musical events that blur modern ideas of public and private, cultivating an environment of convivial conversation, and participating in piano performance indicate that Naneta routinely undertook gendered labor that affirmed her claim to 19th century codes of femininity. Men like her husband also engaged in these activities, but their participation did not carry the same ideological power. For middle-class men, sociability was a valuable activity. For women, it was a duty. In this light, Andreas's use of the ideas of Naneta's piano-playing hands in published material about the Streicherstein firm may also be a rhetorical strategy to justify Naneta's labor as a woman piano maker. By connecting her skills as a pianist, a normative activity for women, with her position as a piano maker, much less normal, Andreas provided readers and potential customers with a more legible narrative about Naneta's gender in relation to her occupation. If readers who might have perhaps hesitated about purchasing an instrument from a woman maker understood that she approached piano making as a player, they might perhaps be more receptive to the craftswoman and to her products. We can see examples of the way in which Naneta balanced her intertwining responsibilities as a woman piano maker, pianist, and host in the 1860 diary of physician Karl Börsey. He mentions her in 2 entries in his diary during a kind of touristic social call on June 24th and at a musical tea, musikalische Tee, in the Streicher Concert Hall on August 8th. So what follows is my translation of what Bersey wrote about the earlier visit in June. Andreas Streicher received me most amicably and introduced me to his wife, who was working in her workshop. She welcomed Karl Amender's greetings very warmly, and I sat down with her, and we chatted from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Not a.m. The time had flown by so quickly that I was surprised when Streicher said to me at parting, "Stay here for lunch, it is so late." Bersey continues. She learned to make instruments with her father in Augsburg out of sheer love of music. And when she married, she really was the one who actually worked in the workshop. Streicher was a piano teacher at that time and only later began to work in the production of his instruments. Bersey shows here that after spending time in the workshop during the morning, Nanetta and Andreas make time to talk with and provide an excellent lunch for their visitor. He then provides a rather unflattering physical description of her, which I will not quote here, but is also at pains to highlight Nanetta's labour as a piano maker. Their discussion was not only long, but wide-ranging. Bersey recounts other parts of Nanetta's life story, such as her first meeting with Beethoven, and her study of phrenology, a 19th century pseudoscience. That they talked for several hours indicates that Nanetta was an adept conversationalist who seemed at ease speaking with new acquaintances about her life, work, and interests. Bersey goes on in this entry to describe the workshop, instruments, concert hall, and the warm hospitality he received from the family. When he returned to the Streicher concert hall on August 8th, Bersey had this to say. "I had a rather pleasant evening with Streicher. It was a musical tea. Berg, the composer, first played a trio and then variations on the Tiroler Lied for two pianos with Sophie Streicher. Both very well done and promising. The girl plays her piano quite capitally. I must also note that music for two such master pianos as Streicher's is wonderful. It is such a full music." The variations had so much originality that I thought they were Louis Ferdinand's compositions. Nanetta Streicher played a double sonata of power with her Sophie, which I did not like so much, although it was nice to hear. After a cup of coffee drunk in the garden, everything is available in the beautiful music hall, and until 10 o'clock, the ear can enjoy the wonderful pleasure. So during the second visit, Nanetta and her daughter, Sophie, engage in other forms of labour, musical performance at an evening concert in the Streicher Hall. This shows us that social and musical responsibilities were shared among members of the Streicher family, and also that work effectively extended into the evening after Nanetta's commitments in the workshop were complete. It is also worth noting that Bersey seems particularly taken with the effect of hearing two Streicherstein pianos playing together, and that he later bought one of the company's instruments. His warm reception by the family and opportunity to hear not one but two pianos in action may well have influenced his own decision to purchase one. I now want to expand on the ways in which Nanetta and Andreas collaborated in their work outside of the piano workshop. As I have demonstrated, piano performance had long been a part of Nanetta's role in the company. Once she and Andreas married, and particularly in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, these concert activities expanded significantly. The more formal musical events that took place in the Streicherstein household, and then the concert hall, now involved Andreas, his pupils, and many of their other musical connections. Building on Nanetta's established practice, Andreas's role as a pedagogue, composer, and important figure in Viennese musical culture appear to be key factors in the formalization and extension of these performances. Well-known pianists such as Magdalena von Kurzberg and Henrietta von Pereira, née Einstein, studied with Andreas and performed alongside their teacher, and sometimes Nanetta herself, on Streicherstein pianos at these concerts. Two piano arrangements of works like those Bosie heard from Berg and other composers like Czerny and Prince Louis Ferdinand seem to have been a particularly favoured genre. Events like these enabled Nanetta and Andreas to develop and maintain social networks involving both their middle-class counterparts, such as doctors and civil servants, and elite aristocratic music lovers. These social networks were the same networks that supplied many of their existing or potential customers. Not only Bosie, but figures like Karl Bertuch bought Streicherstein instruments in the course of visiting the workshop and attending concerts at the Streicher residence. Piano performance was a means of advertising the instruments, using some of Vienna's best performers, and was a means of displaying the success of the company more broadly through the brilliance of their concert hall. In other words, the skills Andreas possessed as a professional musician and teacher and composer, and Nanetta's well-honed attributes as a host and pianist were used in service of their company and produced valuable social and economic outcomes for the couple. Nanetta and Andreas successfully led their company together for more than 20 years. In that time, they used their combined strengths to build and maintain one of Europe's leading piano-making companies in terms of innovation, quality, and prestige. When their son Johann Baptist became joint owner with his mother in 1824, his parents took partial retirement and dedicated themselves to literary projects until they passed away only a few months apart in 1833. Through the 19th century and into the 20th, the centrality of Beethoven to the emergence of musicology and the extensive research into his letters crystallized Nanetta's image as a Hausmutter, the feminine archetype of the household manager, rather than Meisterin, the master craftswoman, and codified Andreas's image as the remarkable piano maker. That is to say, musicologists or music writers such as Thayer and Lütke took Beethoven's individual view of the couple and their roles and replicated its inaccuracies in ways that suited their own understandings of gender. What Tilman and I have shown in our presentation today is that by taking the collaborative relationship of Nanetta Streicherstein and Andreas Streicher and their musical labour both in and outside the workshop into account, their contributions cannot and should not be tidied away into such neat, stereotypically gendered boxes. Thank you.
Thank you both very much.
This would also say thank you for listening.
Tilman and Hester, can you hear me, you two? When I speak now, Tilman?
I am just about to switch over.
Okay, good.
Tilman and Hester, you can come back on screen.
Okay, Thank you both very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Good.
Okay.
That was a fantastic, very interesting and rich presentation. And I'm sure that we have questions. We have the capability to take questions both in the room and also from our online audience. But why don't I start by inviting questions from anybody here? Feel free to say your question and I will paraphrase it so that Tilman and Hester can hear. So the floor is open. If anybody would like to ask Kimberly Marshall.
Yes. I'm curious about Nanetta's younger brother, because she would have gained maturity at age 25, I think you said?
The question is about Nanetta's younger brother. Kimberly Marshall is asking, so she would have gained maturity at 25, you said?
Yeah, but my question
Yes, so the question is, how much younger was he, and why do we think they didn't wait until he was of age so that he could take over the father's business? Was there something unusual about her, or what was going on? Tilman is smiling here.
We are talking about Vienna or about directly after Johann Andreas Stein's death?
Both. The question is...
Yeah. Well, we don't know really about Augsburg. I mean, he was 16 or 17 or something like that. So I don't know whether they already knew whether he was actually going to stick in the piano business or not. I'm not sure. We have no documentation about that. The Vienna time and his coming of age has a twist that we didn't mention because of time restraints. But now, thanks for the anecdote. He married in 1796. And for being able to marry while still underaged, he needed consent of the person who was in charge of him, which was Nanette. And by marrying, he came prematurely on age. So he became independent through this marriage. And so what we can fantasize is, because Nanette was in on this whole story, is that at that point they were actually building him up as somebody to take more responsibility in the workshop.
Yeah, I'd add that, so when their father died, like Tilman said, Matthias was only 16, so he was a child. And his sister was, Nanetta was 7 years older or so than he was. So he was very much the baby of the family and in no position to lead a workshop. And it wouldn't surprise me if that kind of dynamic kind of remained in place up to a certain extent. And I wonder if that dynamic was part of the tension that developed between Matthias on the one hand and his elder sister and brother-in-law. So to build on what Tilman also just said, when Matthias married, he had gained some of the responsibilities of a full adult, but didn't yet have the full economic and social agency of an adult because he was under his sister's authority. And that was probably pretty frustrating. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Great. Any other questions? I would just like to follow up actually on that question myself. I was wondering if you could give us a sense or the degree to which Nanette's role in this firm has a kind of long prehistory in the ways that women functioned within the guild system in Germany. And I think about this. Organists, learn about, of course, all the organists who had to marry the daughters of the previous organists in northern Germany. And we think of that as a kind of vestige of guild systems in which widows were able to run companies and run workshops after their husbands died, and as could their daughters. So there was actually quite an independent role for women within that system. And whether what we're seeing here is actually not so much an anomaly, but actually something that in fact has a kind of legitimacy that runs all the way back to that system, and whether perhaps Augsburg, with its very, very strong craft tradition, may have been a place where those kinds of practices were continuing. I don't know if you see any other kinds of situations there or in contemporary workshop situations that might offer a parallel.
I can start with this one. So yes, I think it's certainly much more appropriate to think about Nanetta's work as a woman piano maker from the 18th century forward as opposed to the 19th century back. A lot of our views of women and work often get filtered through the 19th century ideology of domesticity and, the angel of the house. where women are not doing any kind of work outside the home. And that's really an historical anomaly. So like you say, women, even within the guild system, were highly active, and they could take over and run workshops after their husbands had passed away. And in some guilds and other industries, were even fully fledged guild members. As for Naneta's relationship regarding guilds, my understanding, once she's in Vienna, is that she is very much working outside the guild system. She's kind of on a parallel track because she gets her license to work directly from the emperor, from the government. And she doesn't seem to have had much interaction with the actual Viennese organ makers guild. Maybe Tilman has more to add on that.
Actually, no. I think we had it all here. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe there's another place to find parallels might be in painters and painters' families, where in this period you have a lot of women working in very distinguished positions that may offer some kind of parallel.
Yes, and I should add, there are also women working in all elements of the instrument making industry in much more hidden ways. So I think Jenny Nex's research on women in instrument making in London in the 18th century is a really, really helpful source on this matter. She shows women like Barbara Schudy Broadwood handling the accounts for her family firm, and women doing all kinds of manual work as well. So a lot of behind the scenes labor that isn't often captured by documents.
Yeah, great. Any other questions? Yes.
I know that Nanette Strecker wrote a couple of marches. I was wondering if there. Oh, thank you.
Oh, great. We have a microphone.
Can you hear me better now?
Can you hear?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay.
No, not really. Sorry.
I'm
Hold on.
wondering if you could tell us if Nanette Strecker wrote any music that you know of, other than the two marches, which I know have been published at least once recently.
Do we know whether Nanette Streicher wrote more music other than the two marches that have been published recently?
I'm only aware of the marches. Oh, sorry, there is a lead which was also published recently by the same firm, and that was composed when she was in Augsburg. But so that's three pieces that I'm aware of.
Interesting. But there may be more just hidden in archives. So tell us a little bit more about the status of the Streicher archive. You mentioned that the letters are in private hands. Tilman, did you mention that? Only partially available to the public?
Yes, it's the Streicher family archive in Vienna, and I mean, I shouldn't complain because they actually have been really helpful with email requests and single clarifying single points. And I especially also should, I remember when my wife Robin Blanton was doing her dissertation on Johann Andreas Stein, she was actually allowed to travel to Vienna and to work on Johann Andreas Stein's notebook, the real one, in the archives for several days. So, I mean, there's a certain opening there, but there's also certain protectiveness because Uta Goebel-Streicher, who is the main researcher and representative of the family there, is a musicologist who wants to do research on the Stein family. And so it is not entirely freely available. There are lots of letters that we don't know about. And, well, the other documentary quirk that we have, of course, is that the entire correspondence between Streicher and Heidkopf and Hertel, which was extensive because they did, he and Hertel actually struck up a friendship very quickly in their business relationship. The entire correspondence has been lost in the Second World War, and there's only very few excerpts that are surviving.
Right. And how many pianos, I mean, in terms of documents that survive, of course, the pianos themselves are documents. How many of those actually from Nanette's hand are there that we know about?
Yeah, that research has, Michael Latcham has done that research, and so I would have to look in one of his books to look at the statistics, but I mean, it's a fraction of what the output was. But there are enough instruments, it seems, to document the very fast development in the beginning of the 19th century, even though there are some gaps. So we are talking, I think, about in the first decade of the 19th century, maybe we're talking about 10 or 15 instruments or something like that.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Yeah, yes. Alex and then Andrew.
All right, how's this? Well, or you can repeat it.
Can you hear? Yes.
I'm curious about, Tilman, you mentioned the word sensitive hands and sensitive instruments and sensitive players, and I was curious about that adjective, if that was a very, particular word in German, or how that might relate to other aesthetic values in this time, in this place, that sort of thing.
Did you hear the question? I'll repeat it. So the question was about the adjective sensitive applied to sensitive hands, and whether you could say a little bit more about the word in German and the implications for the larger aesthetic culture, especially in Germany in this period.
Well, there's a problem that I don't have my printouts here of the documents unless I find them very quickly. I am not sure that this is the type of sensitive that Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach would have been talking about. But we are talking about the same tradition. We are talking about half a generation later in prolongation of that. I think Johann Andreas Stein, the father, was very much the inventor of sensitive instruments for sensitive musicians to make light and shade music and to express their feelings directly into the keys. And he went very far with that, like trying to invent new technologies and refine technologies that existed. But I think this particular type of sensitive hands, it's sort of a blueprint remainder of that type of parlance, but I don't think it is so specific anymore at that point.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank
That's
you.
my impression. Hester, do you have the same impression there?
I don't think I've got anything to add. No, that you said it all.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
Yes, Andrew Willis. So this question, to follow up on this question of sensitivity, the description that Mozart gives of hearing Stein's daughter play the forte piano as a child seems not to correspond to that. I think he focused on the heaviness of her hands. And I'm wondering if it was her gradual initiation into the mysteries of piano building that had something to do with developing this greater sense of the importance of light and shade and sensitivity in playing.
That's a great question. So the question from Andrew Willis was that this adjective of this description of her sensitive hands doesn't seem to accord with Mozart's description of Stein's daughter's playing, which seems to emphasize a certain heaviness. And Andrew's asking whether we think that perhaps her greater familiarity with the technologies, with actually building the instruments, might have contributed to her developing a more sensitive, finer, refined sensitivity to the light and shade that the pianoforte afforded.
Yeah, I would like to answer this question, but I wanted to ask Hester first. Do you have any views on that? Did you work with this?
I mean, I think my first comment is Mozart heard her when she was a small child. And, a child of 6 or 7 is very different from an adult who is now trained in both piano making and piano playing for many, many years. So I think we need to remember her age. And And now I've forgotten the rest of the question. So effectively about the kind of relationship between piano making and playing, right, and her musical development. I certainly think the two are very linked, at least and the way that Andreas and also Georg Griesinger write about her as a piano maker and a piano player seem to kind of enmesh these two roles. And in fact, in the obituary that Andreas wrote for his wife, he seems to construct piano playing almost as an extension of the making process, not a separate activity, but something that is kind of like the final step. He talks about Stein would not let anyone touch the instruments until either Stein himself or Nanette had drawn out the sound that they wanted. So to my mind, this seems to really emphasize a kind of symbiotic relationship between the act of making and the act of playing.
Yeah, I just wanted to fill in on the Mozart letter. So these Mozart Augsburg letters are from 1777, so she was indeed like pretty small. The important point about those letters is that Mozart has various agendas going that have not to do with Nanette necessarily. The one agenda that has to do with Nanette and Johann Andreas Stein is that Mozart wants to convince Stein to find a better teacher for her, because he is not happy with the house pianist of Augsburg for various reasons, not only for the reasons of his teachings. And he uses almost a caricature of Nanette and her shortcomings as a player, as a child, to convince Stein to find something better. So we hope that after this event, there was actually a major development in her playing. That's part of one of the thing. The other thing is that he has his own father to consider as a reflection pane for his writings, and partly he has to tell his father how his hometown Augsburg was faring at the point, and partly he has to justify his actions in Augsburg because he's interacting with certain people, he's not interacting with certain other people. He gets one concert, he gets denied another concert, so the whole letters are full of justifications and of making fun of situations in order to lighten the tone. And so Nanette is unfortunately the target of one of those efforts of making light of the whole thing.
Well, with that, I think we should draw this presentation to a close. Thank you very much, Hester, Jordan, and Tilman Skowroneck. A round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll just take a moment to switch over to our second presentation of this panel. Thank you both very much.